We're back with part 2 of lecture 24 on the civil rights era of the 1960s. We left off in our previous lecture with a discussion of John F. Kennedy's re-election campaign. It's late 1963, November specifically, and we're seeing President Kennedy taking a multi-city tour of Texas. San Antonio, Houston, Fort Worth. His next stop was Dallas. And in Dallas, on November 22nd, he was killed by an assassin's bullet. The suspected killer, Lee Harvey Oswald, had ties to an organized crime family, had lived in the Soviet Union for a period of time. We're never really sure what else might have been uncovered about Oswald, because he too will die within just days of killing President John F. Kennedy. Oswald was gunned down 2 days later, November 24th, by a Dallas nightclub owner by the name of Jack Ruby. This is an actual photograph of Jack Ruby approaching Oswald as he is being transferred to another facility in the custody of Dallas authorities. Ruby walked up, shot him in the gut, and Oswald will pass away from his injuries. Ruby went to jail for the killing of Lee Harvey Oswald and died several years later of lung cancer. He claimed until the day of his death that it was simply grief over losing the President of the United States that had motivated him to kill Lee Harvey Oswald. There are a number of conspiracy theories floating around about did Oswald act alone? Did he have the help of others? Was this something bigger? We don't have time to go into conspiracy theories in this class, nor do I believe in all of them, but for those of you enterprising souls who want to research this more, there's oodles of information on the internet. Back now to the effect of the assassination. The nation is stunned, to say the least, that they had lost this youthful, vigorous president. Now we will see it will be former Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson who will be sworn in on Air Force One. You can see the grieving widow of John F. Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy, standing dazed in a blood-stained coat, watching this passage of power in the presidency on the day of her husband's death. So how will this new president steer the country through this confusing and sad time? First, a little bit of background will be helpful in understanding who Lyndon B. Johnson, or LBJ, was. Johnson had grown up during the Great Depression, and he was a great believer in using the power of the national government to help alleviate suffering and make positive changes. He had served under FDR as director of the National Youth Administration in Texas. And while he was a white Southerner, he held a deep and genuine sympathy for the suffering of others, including Black Americans. In his first presidential address to the country, he stated that a civil rights bill should be passed as a monument to President Kennedy's legacy. "Let us continue," he said, "Kennedy's work in civil rights." Johnson also went on to state that, quote, "the idea and the ideals which he so nobly represented must and will be translated into effective action." Johnson will also favor increasing spending on the part of the federal government to help aid those who were jobless, those who were homeless, those who were suffering in dire poverty. We will see the Civil Rights Act of 1964 ultimately signed into law by President Johnson. Here we finally have a significant piece of legislation that will directly benefit the African American community, as well as other communities of color. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 will finally outlaw segregation and discrimination in public places. Any schools, any programs that received federal funding must integrate their programs or see that that federal funding source was now going to dry up. The act also helped to create an Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that was charged with making sure that applicants for federal jobs, for state jobs, were not being discriminated against because of their race. You need to understand, however, what a political risk President Johnson took in fighting to get this act passed. He had to fight. He had to do a lot of arm twisting. He had to call in a lot of favors. He had to out and out bully a number of Southern legislators who were, by principle, opposed to this act. Why is this a political gamble? Look at the year, 1964. It's another presidential election year. Johnson is running for the presidency in 1964, and he understands that white Southerners within his own party, the Democratic Party, are violently opposed to extending protections to African Americans. He knows that by supporting this act, by helping push it through Congress and signing it into law, that white Southerners are going to abandon his party. They're going to abandon him when Election Day rolls around. And what he predicted came to pass. You see a huge exodus from the Democratic Party of Southern whites in the 1964 presidential election. They do not support LBJ. They certainly do not support extending civil rights to communities of color. Johnson knew this ahead of the election, but he still did the right thing. He still supported the Civil Rights Act. And what this does is set up an interesting voting trend that we will only see magnified in future elections. Increasingly, starting with the 1964 presidential election, white Southerners are abandoning the Democratic Party in droves and instead throwing their support behind Republican nominees for state office, for president, and what have you, all in a way to protest the Democratic Party's embrace of civil rights.